Usually by this time in the semester, I compliment you for being here because the weather is so nice, but I guess we'll have to wait another couple of weeks for that. We have a couple of short reminders as opposed to announcements, and that is that next week in section you will be getting the prompt for your second midterm. Your first midterms will be handed back this week. The director of the Committee on Conscience. Next week, however, our speaker will be our own Barbara Lesh McCaffrey, who's going to speak to you about post-Holocaust writing. And there are readings in your reader that I think you find very, very interesting. Do you have any other?
It will make more sense if you've read them before you come
Yes.
to lecture, because I'll assume that you will have already at least read everything through.
Okay, but on to today's lecture. Any delay, I give you Sally. Careful.
If I tripped over the wire, it would be a real spectacular beginning.
Right.
Thank you very much, Myra and Barbara and Sonoma State for inviting us today. And as Myra mentioned, I was a stylistic editor, kind of a member of the Nazi Party. And Fritz experienced the war in Germany. It wasn't until after the war in 1949 that he returned to the United States. He was able to, because of his birth, having been born in the United States, he could renounce his German citizenship and regain and assume his American citizenship and return to the States. And he then studied at UC Berkeley and became a professor. And I won't say more about the details of their. You should hear that from them. I'll just say that the book. This is our second visit to Sonoma State, and we've been to a number of wonderful places talking about the book, and the book has been translated into German, Dutch, and Italian. We had a wonderful tour in Germany, and the book was very well received there, and there's been a documentary film made that were in Germany. The name of the film is called Reconcile. And if anyone's interested, I can give you information about how to obtain a copy. And there's also, if you're not aware of it, a website that might be interesting to some of you, and that's simply www.uncommonfriendship.com. Okay, without delaying this any further, as Myra so nicely said, I'm going to ask Bernie to come to the podium.
Friends, while the early part of my life was dominated by turmoil, upheaval, and horror, most of the latter part of it was spent under slightly more benign circumstances, practicing law in California. The fact that I chose the law as a career is due to a number of reasons, but there's little question in my mind that after witnessing the breakdown of the basic norms of civilized behavior and the repudiation of decency, tolerance, and human dignity, I was strongly drawn to a profession which holds up as its goals the values that were so brutally trampled upon by the perpetrators of the Nazi atrocities. During recent years, on September 11 in this country, and continuing on in other parts of the world up to the present, humanity has once again come face to face with evil. I believe that the subject and theme of our book are particularly appropriate and opportune for this time of uncertainty. One point of relevance in my mind is that these recent events, just as the centerpiece event of our story demonstrate, that hate and fanaticism can and have done more harm to humanity than the more conventional criminal motives of greed or self-gratification. It is a sad but true fact that the criminals and terrorists who are carrying out the current atrocities, just as the psychopaths who conceived the Holocaust, were somehow able to convince themselves that they were pursuing some just or righteous cause. To the extent that our story and our book contributes to the concept that humanity, decency, and friendship can redeem and heal, I feel we've accomplished everything and more that we could have possibly have hoped for. There's another theme in our story that I believe is highly relevant to the recent explosions of hate. This is the need to be on guard against tendencies that have, since September 11, on occasion manifested themselves, of singling out a particular group for acts of harassment and worse, just because they were members of the same group or nationality that have committed or are committing the crimes. If there is one thing that could harm our country more than the acts of the terrorists, it is to permit ourselves to sink into the abyss of bigotry, and this is the time for people of goodwill to speak out against those dangerous and frightening tendencies. I have an abiding love for books and literature, and a passage from a poem came to my mind almost the instant that I first saw those TV images in New York that will be forever seared in our memories. It is a poem from Edgar Allan Poe called "The City by the Sea," and a stanza of it goes like this: "The melancholy waters lie, so blend the turrets and shadows there that all seem pendulous in air, while from a tall tower in the town, death looks gigantically down." My many friends, my 3 children, and my own conscience have long urged that I tell my story. That I have not done so until relatively recently is due to a number of reasons, including a rather busy career and, frankly, having been endowed by nature of a tendency to procrastinate. That I finally got around to doing so also is due to a number of reasons. First, having passed my 73rd birthday, I'm mindful that the end is much nearer than the beginning, that time is running out. Second, when one is young, it was certainly true in my case, one tends to concentrate on the present. For most of my adult life, I prided myself that I traveled with a minimum of baggage. I realize now that this was more different than mine. While I was a Jew and a survivor of Auschwitz, Fritz was raised in wartime Germany. His father was a Nazi officer, and Fritz himself, in his early youth, was a member of the Jungvolk, the Cub Scout equivalent of the Hitler Youth. By the time we met in the early 1980s, about 40 years following the end of the World War II, we had become Americans. We both accepted the principle that you are responsible for your own actions, these thugs, and anti-Semitic undercurrents running through Hungarian political and cultural life did not disturb what I considered and remember as being essentially a happy and tranquil childhood. All this changed with dramatic suddenness on a very specific date, March 19, 1944, relatively late in the course of World War II. I remember the day very well. I was on my way home from a study in preparation for my upcoming bar mitzvah, when a neighbor woman asked me if I had heard the news. When I asked what news, she told me that the Germans had taken over the country and the government. Within the time available here, I will not go into the details of why this happened at that late stage in the war, but if the time permits and people are interested, I'll be glad to explain it. The effects of the Nazi takeover and the Jews of Hungary were immediate and disastrous. Count to what happened to me, to my family, and to the Jewish community of Tub. Within days following the takeover, the stream of anti-Jewish edicts began. Jews could not travel without specific permission. Soon they could not travel at all. Prominent families in the community, as well as those suspected of subversive activities or associations, began to disappear. By mid-April, all Jews had to wear a prominent yellow star on their outer clothes. On the way to the station, where I witnessed my mother's humiliation at being stripped naked in a crowded room and hand-searched by Nazi thugs. The third was at the brickyard, with only bare earthen floor for accommodations, where an elderly woman, standing up to recite her Sabbath prayers, was clubbed bloody and unconscious by one of the guards. From Tub, we were shipped to a collection point about 50 miles away, where we were unloaded onto a large 2 boys stay with her. Being a 12-year-old, I said I was not about to take a shower with a bunch of women. She didn't argue with me, but her last words to me were, "Whatever you do, stick with your little brother." She left us, and I never saw her again. Next, we were lined up, the males, the remaining, were lined up, and at the head of the line were 2 SS men. They didn't wear white coats, as some of the movies showed. They were wearing SS uniforms. Every day for the next 10 months until my liberation by the Americans during the first week of May 1945 was a battle for survival. That battle took several forms. At first in Auschwitz, it was a matter of trying to avoid being sent to the gas chambers. This was because even though I survived that initial screening process, I kept flunking the physicals that the prisoners were subjected to in order to qualify for a permanent work assignment. Some maggots floating on top, and you were given a bowl of that, and that was your lunch. In the evening, you were given a piece of bread that was about roughly, initially it started out being about 1/4 of a kilo or about 1/2 pound, but as conditions became more strained and supplies ran short, it became not much more than a slice, and occasionally you got a piece of butter or margarine, not butter, but margarine. The upshot of the correspondence was that in the late fall of 1945, after he was sent, demobilized, the war was over, and he was sent home and became a civilian, and he talked it over with his wife. He sent me a letter, and I still have a copy of that letter in German, asking me if I wanted to come to the United States and be a member of his family. This is a pretty incredible story, but even though the story was not told to send a moral message, I believe that it does so nevertheless, and it does so on several levels. The one that I believe is particularly relevant today is the ability of 2 individuals who come from historically different beginnings to be able to surmount the walls that could have divided them, to look beyond the conventional mindset that could have made them, if not hate, at least distrust each other, and enable them to form a friendship.
Or in San Francisco, but my father, actually less for ideological convictions, but out of opportunism. He was a musician, lost his job. He decided to return to Germany in 1933. Took me along. Not so long ago, I found a letter of an uncle of mine who described our arrival back in Germany in 1933. And he said in the letter, little Fritz, that's me, didn't understand a single word of German. So I taught him his first German words, how to say. But my real education started in May of 1945, after the Americans had occupied our village. And they posted a big poster on the town hall with a picture of the Warsaw Ghetto, specifically of a deep ravine with corpses in the bottom and some still hanging on the wall. Some of you may have seen this picture. And on the top, the platform, German soldiers walk around. It seemed like a picture out of Dante's Hell. To do as a work on our past, his past, you've heard an outline, and my own. His as the center of the story, mine as a foil to his. So we collected material. I wrote this. I wrote the text. Bernie wanted to have it presented as in a third person. This is not unusual. You may know Elie Wiesel, whose native tongue is not French. People realize, there are other periods come along, and it has to be maybe retold also in other ways. Case in point is the movie Life is Beautiful, the Italian movie. Now there's a debate about that. It's a fairy tale. I don't know whether you've seen this, but it's a very interesting movie that raises the question whether only people who have lived it can tell their story. But this is not an issue to be settled here. At any rate, to me, to do this was an incredible experience. I think empathy is such an underrated virtue. It means really not just to tolerate somebody who's different, but actually try to put yourself into their lives as much as you can, is to accept them as different from yours and not project maybe your own emotions onto them. It's very important. If you learn how to do it, you will grow. You just become a bigger person, a happier person. Not only, well, maybe not always happier, but at least you become more differentiated as a person. Between us, now Bernie's experience, I was not in a camp, so I cannot really, I would be, impossible to reproduce what he has experienced, but at least try in my language to capture in some ways with it. And Bernie and I worked very closely together, and he would correct, and then we would have conversations about it. What made it easy, some people say, how can you do this? It was, after all, maybe a more eyeball to eyeball reason for it. And I will read you a few passages, and then we open it for discussion. What was also important is the innocence with which we started it. If we had known this was going to be a book, I don't think I could have done it. It's just the total innocence. He wanted to tell his story, or he pointed out, because his family. I was very challenged to try to tell my story as not only a foil to his, but to use some of my own experiences to get into what he was doing, being picked for special. Perhaps who had been an SS officer in charge of a refugee camp near Würzburg and hanged by the surviving inmates at the end of the war might appear. Or perhaps my own father, in his Nazi party uniform, would join us for dinner. Or my host's father and mother as they emerged from the ashes of the crematorium. Although the subject of concentration camps didn't come up over dinner, I couldn't help thinking about it. I noticed that Bernie had light blue eyes, words from the Todesfuge, Death Fugue, of the Jewish poet Paul Celan, a camp survivor who later committed suicide in Paris, crowded in on me. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland, sein Auge ist blau. Death is a master from Germany, his eye is blue. I repeated them several times to myself, recreating in my mind the ritual intensity with which they had on the short side were just about the same height. He was slight and wiry, while I had to watch my weight. I probably looked more Jewish, in quotes, than he did to those who saw people as stereotypes. My mind drifted to my father, who told me once of being terribly afraid of a barber in Germany who had asked if he was Jewish. My father denied it, insisting that appearances can be deceptive. But he had the feeling the barber didn't believe him and would have liked to have cut his throat with a straight-edged razor he used to shave him. The dinner conversation with the Rosners escaped me for a short time, but no one seemed to notice my silence. And my free associations about blue eyes, appearances, and barbers faded away. In reality, Bernie is a year younger than I am. As it turned out, the hours passed quickly during that mild summer evening in Northern California, and the bulk of the experiences that lay underneath it, particularly Bernie's, hence the book. I would now like to read you a longer section. It's the one that I don't always read. I know it's Bernie's one of his favorites, and I think Sally already alluded to it. Indeed, to reconstruct, at least in a narrative, the story of his family was very crucial to me. The only existence these people have, there's no record of them. See, the Nazis didn't just, Bernie's interest in learning and books got the better of him, got him into trouble. A prayer book belonging to one of the pillars of the community sat on the shelf right next to Bernie's customary seat in the synagogue. Day in and day out, Bernie coveted that marvelous leather-bound book so much that one day he stole it, took it home, tore out its pages, and deposited the cover, now devoid of its spiritual content, back in its customary place. Bernie was the prime suspect. When accused of the theft, he denied everything, prompting the owner of the book to comment sarcastically that perhaps an angel had taken it and removed its pages. The boy's insistence on his innocence gained him the nickname Angel Tralala. As the full wrath of his father was about to descend on Bernie's head, a minor religious miracle occurred. The owner of the book, the man who had dubbed him Angel Tralala, pleaded that the boy not be a person who cried easily. And Bernie suspects that his mother was his hypochondriac with an imagined bad heart. She was the emotional font for him and his brother. An articulate storyteller, she would also, who was also the inspiration for his own enduring love of books. He still remembers how beautiful her handwriting appeared in the letters she read aloud to him when he was very young. Bernie's mother was also an expert seamstress and a good cook. She baked delicious sweets, cinnamon swirls, jellied rolls, and the kind of cakes that showed that the village of Tub and its inhabitants were not far from Vienna and its elegant pastries. Bertha Rosner instilled in her boys a sense of duty to take the straight and narrow path. This Hungarian mother employed old-fashioned educational methods. We awakened this quintessential stranger, outsider, wearing ragged clothes and a broad-brimmed hat, descended on my village as well. The nucleus of Bernie's family, father, mother, 2 brothers, was part of a large extended family. Bernie's mother was one of 12 siblings, and his father had 2 brothers with sizable families of their own living in Tub. There was a spinster aunt, who, in contrast to his maternal spinster aunt, the strict Aunt Libby of Kishkunalas, was a gentlewoman. His Uncle Willie had a limp. He also had a daughter with artistic talent, who helped Bernie with an assignment in his drawing class. Unlike his younger brother, Alexander, Bernie couldn't draw, so this cousin sketched a steam engine for him, and Bernie received a high mark for her efforts. But these times came to an end. They ended for Bernie in early spring 1944, when the seasonal rhythms were replaced by the shouts of Nazis. Those harsh new voices disrupted life as the Jews of Tub had known it, and in less than 3 months ordered their deportation and extermination at Auschwitz. There, or in other camps, most of the Jews of Tub were killed. Bernie's literate mother, who thought everything passes. This sentimental song, one of many I learned in my youth, is still sung today in German taverns when the mood is jovial. It promises that after every December, a May will surely follow. The song is usually sung towards the end of an evening of drinking, right before in München steht ein Hofbräuhaus, when people link arms and sway back and forth in a heightened sense of solidarity.
The first line of a song, and others would pick it up. These are instant folk songs. They are not recorded. This one was never recorded, yet its words have remained in my memory, and I can recite them by heart from, almost 60-some years ago. In Yiddish, it goes like this. Echo wie zoi in faravos jokstun sazoi, wie is Vater dein Rachmones, Shomaim Arei, von dem Himmel gib a Blick, zu dem jüdischen Kinder gib Glick, lech eus den Feier, in soll es schön sein, Genick.
Now in English, oh why and for what are you hunting us so? Where is Father your mercy? From heaven give a glance, to the Jewish children give a chance. Extinguish the fire and let it be enough. Planes did not reach them, and the God the inmate invoked was deaf. Now, in conclusion, I will read you the last page of the book, not because it's the last page, because it's more or less also a plea for the new Germany. Germany has changed. They have developed a civil society that is remarkably open, and it's maybe we should start imitating a little bit here. Sorry for saying that. And the Dean conducted Beethoven's Ninth Symphony not far from the ruins of Hitler's bunker. Perhaps our joy over this performance was now no more than a leap of faith, an ephemeral acte imaginaire, but one that we nevertheless embraced. Yet, is such a leap of faith justified? For why would a past moment from Bernie's story, when the dwindling group of survivors at Gunskirchen stacked up corpses, sovereignty over his thoughts? On our last evening in Berlin, we attended a performance of Mozart's Magic Flute at the Staatsoper, located on the main boulevard Unter den Linden, in what used to be the center of East Berlin. Mozart's music floated in the air, a perfect symbol of freedom and order, and the story of the opera unfolded with both its dark night and its illuminating path, with its trials and its victories. For revenge. Thanks.
Get to direct questions. Question. Done. Yeah.
Growing up in Germany during the war, how did you feel about Jews?
But any specific emotions. Some of her belongings. They let her pick up some of the belongings that thugs had thrown in the street. And I looked at her and I thought, she had lost something. This woman had taken something away from her. She somehow projected a sense, she wanted to pretend nothing had happened, something obviously had happened to her, something awful. And I could see, it was disturbed me as a kid. I walked in another Jewish house was smashed. I walked into it, I was curious. I went upstairs and looked at everything was smashed. Then I got frightened, I ran out and found in the Jews, quite frankly, because of everything else. It's very interesting how this is a history, how that the war really provided a cover also, in some sense, for the Nazis to hide their crime, at least in front of many people. Anyway, but this is my feeling that, and after the war, of course, I began to get to know German Jews personally here, and that was an eye-opener for me. And most would know Jews very well now, because although many Jews have come back to Germany, the Russian Jews, they stay there and so on. But most Germans just don't know Jews personally. So they have these strange, abstract relationships to Jews in general. That's a long question, but Professor, I talk long-windedly. Does that give partial answer? Yeah. Okay.
I have a question for Ray. When all your family was in your house with you and you had like 18 to 20 people you said living with you, did you let them know that?
Sure, and I probably just don't remember quarrels as well, but basically it was just went without saying that you got to help each other, and at least within our family group, we basically pooled our resources. When these other folks moved into our home, they brought whatever they could in the way of food, and by then food became quite short. We shared, and we slept on the floor, and as I say, partly convenient memory. I'm sure the kids must have fought, and it's just there were at least half of those people were youngsters, but basically we knew that this had to be done, and it was done. That was true certainly at that stage. There were other stages, and by other people down through the camp, when this kind of partnership and brotherhood did not prevail. When you're down to the nitty-gritty survival, it brings out both the best and the worst in people. But that did not yet happen when we were together in the ghetto.
My name is also for Mr. Rosner. I was wondering, you talked a lot about how in the chapter that we read and you talked about today, how you really tried to put your past behind you, and so you went through most of your life in America not really acknowledging.
And I basically led my life until I told my story I separated myself not just from my past, but I never went to Holocaust survivors conferences. I did not participate in the Spielberg living history because I felt in some respects, because I just did not want to confront what I found that since now that I've talked to many, not as many survivors because there are not that many around anymore, but their children, who says that if anything, some of their parents or whoever was in the camp were even more reticent about talking to it. So that was one reason. But another reason was, to be quite honest, and one of the things that I wanted to do is tell an honest story. I felt that I have paid my dues. I was absolutely determined not to be a victim again. I was going to become American and to be accepted. I was excluded from everything. There is a little image in the book about the celebration of what is the equivalent of the 4th of July in Hungary. And I was in school at the time, and our school sent a contingent with a Hungarian flag to be in the parade. And everybody said, "You Jews are not Hungarians. You don't belong here." And this exclusion prompted me, given the basically welcoming surrounding and atmosphere in the United States, just become part of the establishment and part of adopting the culture and the coin of the realm. And I came here in the 50s where the success was defined in being successful, getting good grades, knowing exactly where you're going to go to school and what you're going to do afterwards. And I did all of that with a vengeance. And I hope that explains the two aspects of the, as I say, I'm not apologizing, I'm not bragging about it. This is my story. This is what I was.
Let me add something to this in general. You see, after the war, in Germany too, Holocaust was not studied and discussed very much. There are very specific reasons for that. I remember in 1950, the Allies began to hire Germans to have a new army again. We needed Germans against Russia, against communism. So for decades, it just wasn't the thing to talk about. It's only when after certain things happened, like the Diary of Anne Frank had a big effect in Germany. But even more so, in 1979, there was a series, the Shoah series, which really became a national kind of Oh yeah, the Holocaust series, because the Jews the Jews portrayed there were typical upper middle class European Jews. They were not Eastern European Orthodox Jews that looked different with pikes and hats and so on. So that family and their fate in camps, it just blew Germany away. They had discussions and conferences and TV shows, and then it became, it appeared. And I think the fact that we wanted very early to have Germans on our side against the Russians helped hide it. One specific example, my father always claimed in 1947, he was in prisoner of war. One of the first things the British the army did, they said, which one of you had experiences in the East Front? And 3 SS officers announced that they had experiences fighting the Russians. They were whisked away in staff cars, not to be punished, no, to be promoted. So, there was that unfortunate history that much of, in general, that was hiding this fact of anyway, that's just a context a little bit.
This is a question for one. Was your faith affected as a result of the Holocaust? And secondly, was it affected, if it had been original, was it affected again as a result of writing the book?
Could you repeat your question again? I didn't quite get the
I
question.
would like to know whether your faith was affected by your experience.
You start that one.
Both
Well,
of you.
Yeah, okay, you first.
I'll take it first because it's a pretty important issue in my life. First, as I've indicated in my speech and my presentation, I came from a very strict Orthodox Jewish family. And one might suggest that when I ended up in the concentration camp and saw all that horror, that your faith would be shaken. How can there be a God? How can you, all those things with all of these going on. But that was not the case. Among other things, Jews are not the first time that Jews were slaughtered. It's just that it was not done probably quite that systematically, and they hung on to their faith. There's the stories of Jews being sent to the stake, burning fire, and saying the traditional prayer, God is one. And I retained my faith throughout that period, and there's little question in my mind but that holding on to that faith made a difference between my being able to survive. I did part ways. I'm no longer religious. The change happened actually not when I came to this country. It came before then. It came when we were picked out of this refugee camp, the shabby, just bare bones kind of a place. Obviously, not like a concentration camp, but we went to an orphanage, and this was run by people by then Palestinian Jews, now Israelis, of course, who were members of the British Army, who formed a brigade during the Second War, who fought very valiantly in several of the battles. But at the end of the war, their mission became to gather up the remnants of the survivors and start shepherding them towards ports in southern Europe, Italy, so that they could be taken to Israel. And these people were brave, assertive people to whom their Jewishness was not a religious one. And I agree with all the things that we were told about Jews, that they're cowards, they don't know how to fight. And these were the opposite extreme. They were 180 degrees different. So they became my role models. And they did not in any sense try to brainwash me. But I became non-religious because they in effect became my role model. So by the time I came to this country, I was not really anymore a person practicing the Jewish religion.
What you might call Protestant light. You know, you were baptized, you went every Christmas and New Year's Eve. So faith was not a major force in my early life at all. And it didn't affect me one way or the other because I did not have a pronounced religious structure, upbringing. Except I do remember the great comfort you got when the war as it got worse, you know, roaring planes overhead at night. By the way, we here, Americans, let me just have a footnote here. We never see in America squadrons of fighter planes, do we? Let's say 50, you never see it here. American population isn't shown our military power in the air. You see the Blue Angels, there are 4 of them who make somersaults over San Francisco. But I still hear at night sometimes, at 3 in the morning, I hear this certain deep rumbling of planes, obviously military planes who fly someplace, probably to Iraq. So in a sense, I'm the planes coming overhead, and having religious services and the intensity of prayer to protect us from bombs that might fall. That I do remember. But then my faith basically, as a medievalist, of course, I studied Catholicism intensely and had a great deal of sympathy for that religion. Once you write books about something, you get attracted to it in some ways, but I'm not a practicing, just like Bernie, a secularist with a bad conscience. But I would say to study history, to admit the Japanese started, in their history books, start World War II after Pearl Harbor. It's not even brought up. That is the first thing. And then I have a psychological approach, as I try to point out. It's really that the more you learn about the victims your country has caused, how they were as human beings, the empathy, the idea of empathy. We should teach empathy as a subject, actually, in some fashion, to really give people a sense of the other, saying, I don't understand him, therefore he's bad. And we should, but I don't know, it would take a long time. I think when we see things happening now, just beginning to shape up between Shiites and Sunnis, they're just starting maybe, and of course Israel and Palestine. It's a sad story, and I hang on to little stories you hear about some websites that some Jewish mothers and some Palestinian mothers try to communicate. Well, good, maybe it has to start that way. As Bernie said, maybe that's a very interesting question. My father, yeah. Well, he was, of course, well, your fathers are interesting. Mine was particularly, I thought, well, anyway. he was a musician in San Francisco, and of course he knew many Jews personally. He played with them in bands and in orchestras. My father was a Nazi, but he was not anti-Semitic. Believe it or not. He just didn't have any, that had nothing to do with it for him. In fact, historians today say that anti-Semitism was not the main driving force of Nazism at all, but it was not the main driving force of it. So he, after the war, I confronted him with this. I said, look, what about it? And he just has a ritual answer. He said, it's the worst crime ever committed. I don't think he ever felt it. It just was a ritual. He just couldn't face up. And I said, well, I pressed him some more. I said, well, they showed us in the camp when he was a prisoner of war in England, they showed us atrocities from the Auschwitz. And one of the officers said, how did they do this to us? And held his hand in front of the camera lens so they wouldn't be exposed to it. He actually used as an explanation. It hurt him to find out about it. A very strange attitude of that generation. And there are no psychological explanations for it. I firmly believe, maybe I'll step on somebody's toes here, psychology, as Freud has invented it, can't explain these camps. It's something, I think we need other categories to explain that violence. And there's no simple psychological explanation either.
Join me in thanking Fritz and Bernie.